In the sun-scorched heart of Nevada, a debt-ridden historian was about to make the most reckless purchase of her life. What started as a desperate bid at a government auction took a shocking turn when she uncovered a hidden fortune that powerful men had killed to protect. Margaret Maggie O'Connell wasn't your typical academic. For 3 years, she had spent her life teaching history no one cared about and writing papers no one would publish. Known for her stubborn refusal to let the past stay buried. When she bought an abandoned railway station for 30 cents in a dusty Nevada town, she had no idea she was walking into a conspiracy 4 decades old. Maggie discovered ledgers hidden in the walls that would lead to the unraveling of a railroad empire built on stolen wages and murdered witnesses. What began as a search for forgotten records would become a fight for justice that rewrote history. The Carson Depot and the territory of Nevada would never be the same after 843 names were carved in stone. Workers erased from history, finally remembered. And the daughter of a murdered engineer finally learned why her father had to die. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I've spent 3 years teaching history to children who don't care and writing papers no one will publish. 3 years since my father died in what they called an accident. 3 years of poverty dressed up as academia, living in rented rooms that smell like other people's cooking, darning the same 2 skirts until the thread shows through. So when the government liquidation notice arrived at the boarding house, I read every line. Not because I had money to spend, I had $17 to my name, but because abandoned properties sometimes hold abandoned records. And records are the only currency I understand. The auction was held in a sun-blasted Nevada town called Ash Hollow, 3 hours by train from anywhere that mattered. The kind of place where the gold rush came and went, leaving behind more dust than dreams. I arrived on a Tuesday morning when the heat already shimmered off the cracked Main Street like water that would never quench anything. The courthouse steps served as the auction block. A clerk with sweat stains spreading under his arms read from a list in a monotone that suggested he'd done this 100 times before. Farm equipment went for pocket change. A defunct saloon sold for $8. A boarding house with a caved-in roof fetched $12. Then he reached the bottom of the list. Depot lot, parcel 17. Abandoned railway station on the old Carson Spur line. Structure unsound. No utilities. Sold as is, buyer assumes all liability. He looked up, squinting against the sun. No one moved. Opening bid, $1. Silence. A tumbleweed, I swear to God, an actual tumbleweed, rolled past the courthouse. Someone coughed. The clerk sighed and checked his pocket watch. 50 cents then. More silence. I felt something stir in my chest. The same reckless impulse that made my father board trains to investigate shipping discrepancies when everyone told him to let it go. The same impulse that got him killed. 25 cents, the clerk said, his voice flattening with defeat. I raised my hand before I could think better of it. The clerk's eyebrows lifted. He looked at me the way men always look at women in spaces they don't expect us, with confusion shading into contempt. Ma'am, I should clarify that this is an actual railway station. Not suitable for... I understand what a railway station is, I said, keeping my voice level. 25 cents. He opened his mouth, then closed it, consulted his papers. Regulations require a minimum bid acceptance threshold. 30 cents final. I walked up those courthouse steps, feeling every eye on my back. I had $17 in my purse. I counted out 30 cents in nickels and pennies, placing each coin in the clerk's damp palm with more satisfaction than I'd felt in years. He wrote me a receipt on paper so thin it was nearly transparent. The ink bled where his thumb pressed too hard. Good luck with that, he said. And the way he said it made it sound like a curse. The station sat 7 miles outside town, accessible by a dirt road that had mostly surrendered to sagebrush. I hired a boy with a donkey cart to take me out. He didn't speak the entire ride, just kept glancing sideways at me like I might be mad. Maybe I was. We crested a low rise, and there it was. The station rose from the desert floor like a cathedral built by people who'd forgotten their god halfway through construction. 3 stories of dark timber and stone that had weathered to the color of dried blood. Windows lined the upper floors, most of them broken, watching the empty landscape with blind eyes. The platform stretched along the front, warped boards curling up like fingers, reaching for something they'd never hold again. The main entrance was sealed, with planks nailed in an X pattern. Someone had painted "Condemned" across them in white letters that had faded to ghost pale. "This is it?" I asked, though I knew it was. The boy nodded. He wouldn't help me unload my trunk and bedroll. Just dumped them on the platform and left, the donkey's hooves raising dust that hung in the still air long after he'd disappeared over the rise. I stood there as the sun began its descent, staring at what I'd bought for 30 cents, a mouth that forgot how to speak. I thought, and pulled out my field journal to write it down. If I was going to do this, live in a condemned building, to salvage whatever records might remain, I was going to document it properly. That's what historians do. We bear witness. We let the evidence speak, even when the evidence is a dying building in the middle of nowhere. I found a side entrance half hidden behind wild growth. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and when I pushed it open, the smell hit me first. Dust and dry rot and something metallic underneath, like old blood or older coins. The interior was vast. The ticket office sat to my left, its window still intact, the brass bars tarnished but solid. The waiting area spread before me, benches overturned, a chandelier hanging at an angle from a ceiling, stained with water damage that mapped continents no explorer ever charted. I dragged my trunk into the ticket office and made camp. The counter would serve as my desk. The floor, swept clean of debris, would hold my bedroll. I had a week's worth of candles, a box of matches, and enough dried food to last until I could walk back to town for supplies. That first night, I catalogued what I could see by candlelight. The freight room stretched beyond the waiting area, its loading dock doors chained from the inside. A telegraph bay sat empty, wires severed, the equipment long since salvaged. Stairs led to upper floors I didn't dare explore in the dark. I noticed gaps in the wall paneling, places where boards didn't quite meet flush. Tool marks along the baseboards, recent enough that they hadn't weathered smooth. Someone had been here. Someone had modified this place after it closed. I was on my hands and knees, examining one such gap, when I found the marble. A child's toy, blue glass with a white spiral frozen inside, lodged in a crack between floorboards. I worked it free and held it up to the candlelight. The spiral seemed to move in the flickering glow. Beside where the marble had been, I found something else. A brass tag, oval-shaped, with letters stamped into the metal, SC 1887. I turned it over in my fingers. Brass doesn't tarnish easily. This tag was old, but well-preserved, deliberate, the kind of thing someone attaches to valuable property or secrets. I wrote in my journal by candlelight, Day 1. Station, purchased. Initial survey suggests structural modifications post-closure. Found, child's marble, brass tag marked SC 1887. The building wants to tell me something. I'm going to let it speak. I blew out the candle and lay in the dark, listening to the wind whistle through broken windows. The station creaked and settled around me like a body learning to breathe again after years of holding still. At midnight, I felt it. A draft, cold and purposeful, cutting through the ticket office from a direction that made no sense. I followed it to the wall I'd examined earlier, the one with the gaps. I pressed my palm against the paneling. The wood was cold. Too cold for a sealed interior wall in the desert heat that lingered even after dark. And then I heard it. A faint clink, like metal touching metal, from somewhere inside the wall. My hand was already reaching for the pry bar in my trunk before I remembered to be afraid. I didn't sleep after I heard that sound. Couldn't. I sat on my bedroll until dawn light crept through the ticket window, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. But the cold draft was real. The gaps in the paneling were real. And I've never been good at leaving mysteries alone. My father used to say that was my greatest strength and my most dangerous flaw. When the sun finally rose high enough to see by, I pulled my trunk against the suspicious wall and climbed onto it. Up close, the tool marks were obvious. Someone had carefully removed this section of paneling, then reinstalled it, but not quite perfectly. The nails were newer than the wood, their heads still showing some shine. I wedged the pry bar into the gap and pulled. The wood groaned. Dust sifted down. Then the entire panel came loose, with a crack that echoed through the empty station. Behind it was a cavity about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, carved into the space between the interior wall and the exterior stone. Someone had chiseled through support beams to create it. Inside, 3 ledgers wrapped in oilskin, bound with twine that had been sealed with red wax. A canvas pouch that clinked when I lifted it. And a card, yellowed with age, covered in neat columns of initials and numbers. My hands shook as I unwrapped the first ledger. The oilskin crackled, brittle from years in the dry air. The leather cover beneath bore no title, just a date stamped in gold, 1887, the same year as the brass tag. I opened it carefully. The pages were filled with meticulous handwriting, recording what looked like transactions. Columns labeled name, hours, rate, and deferred. Page after page of names, some English, some not. Chinese characters, Spanish names, Irish surnames. The deferred column was always filled in. The rate column often showed 0. These were wage records, but wages that had never been paid. The pouch held mineral samples. I spread them on the ticket counter, rough chunks of rock shot through with metallic veins. I wasn't a geologist, but I knew enough to test them. I had vinegar in my food supplies. When I dripped it on the largest sample, it fizzed carbonate, which meant the veins could be silver or lead, both valuable. Both reasons men killed each other in Nevada in the 1880s. The coded card made the least sense. Rows of initials, JW, MC, TL, dozens more, each followed by a series of numbers that could be amounts or dates or coordinates. No key, no explanation. But at the bottom, in the same handwriting as the ledgers, someone had written, "Equity held in trust pending audit, SCP-SC, the brass tag." Samuel Clayton Pike, it had to be. I'd heard that name before. My father had mentioned it in his letters, the ones he sent in the months before he died. He'd been investigating irregularities in railway shipping manifests, freight that was logged but never delivered, payroll that vanished between terminals. He'd mentioned the Pike family, railroad barons who'd financed half the spur lines in Nevada. And he'd mentioned a fire, an audit fire that destroyed records in 1887. The same year, stamped on this ledger, my father died investigating ghosts. And I'd just found their bones. I needed help. Someone who knew the local history, who'd been here long enough to remember what people wanted forgotten. Someone who might know what SCP stood for and why these records were hidden instead of destroyed. Rewrapped the ledgers carefully, tucked them into my trunk, and locked it. The mineral samples and the card went into my satchel. Then I walked the 7 miles back to Ash Hollow, my boots raising dust that hung in the morning air like questions I couldn't yet answer. The library sat on Main Street, a 2-story brick building that looked too permanent for a town that was slowly dying. I found the librarian at her desk, sorting cards in a catalogue drawer. Ruth Calloway was perhaps 60, with silver hair pinned in a neat bun and eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. She looked up when I entered, and something in her expression shifted when she saw the dust on my clothes. "You're the girl who bought the old Carson depot," she said. "Not a question. I'm the historian who bought it, yes." A smile ghosted across her lips. "Historian? That's a dangerous occupation in a town built on forgetting." I set the mineral samples on her desk. "I found these in the station, hidden deliberately, along with wage records from 1887 and a coded card with initials." Ruth's face went very still. She didn't touch the samples, didn't even look at them directly. Instead, she rose and walked to the library's front window, looking out at the empty street. "Those initials," she said quietly. Did they have numbers beside them? Yes, and the ledgers. Did they show wages as deferred? How did you know that? Ruth turned to face me. The afternoon light from the window cast half her face in shadow. Because I typed the letters that created that system 40 years ago, when I was a clerk for the Pike Railway Company. Before they told us to burn everything, my heart was beating too hard. The audit fire. There was no audit, Ruth said. Just fire. Just erasure. The Pike family converted railway workers' wages into company stock, told them they'd be rich when the stock matured. Then they issued new stock that diluted the original shares to nothing. The workers got paper. The Pikes got their labor for free. My God, your father knew, Ruth said, and I felt the room tilt. He came to me 6 years ago, asking about missing manifests. I told him what I knew. 2 weeks later, his train derailed. Faulty brakes, they said. Act of God. The words hung in the air between us. My father hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered for asking the wrong questions. Why are you telling me this? They managed because you found something they've spent decades looking for. And because, she stopped, glancing toward the library door. A man stood there, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. He hadn't been there a moment ago. Because, Ruth continued, her voice dropping to barely a whisper, you're being watched. Have been since you bought that station. And you need to be very, very careful what you do next. She crossed to her desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a skeleton key. The metal was old, dark with tarnish. She pressed it into my palm, folding my fingers around it. For the older doors, she said, not the newer locks. The station has levels you haven't found yet, and someone is going to come asking questions soon. Someone who smiles while he lies. The man in the doorway was gone when I looked again. Don't work alone after dark, Ruth said. And for the love of God, don't trust anyone who tells you they're there to help. I left the library, with the skeleton key burning a hole in my pocket and the mineral samples still sitting on Ruth's desk. She'd refused to let me take them. Evidence, she'd said, needs witnesses. The walk back to the station felt longer. The sun was starting its descent, painting the desert in shades of blood and bruise. I kept looking over my shoulder, but the road behind me stayed empty. When I reached the depot, I found fresh boot prints on the platform. Someone had been here while I was gone, and the side door I'd left closed was standing open. I stood on that platform for a full minute, weighing options. Run back to town and lead whoever this was to Ruth, enter the station and face them alone. Or wait outside until dark and risk losing whatever advantage daylight gave me. I chose the third option historians always choose. I went looking for evidence. The boot prints were clear in the dust, size 10 or 11 men's, deep heel impressions, someone heavy or someone carrying weight. The prints led from the platform to the side door, then disappeared where the floor inside had been swept clean by wind and time. I pulled the skeleton key from my pocket. Ruth had said it was for older doors, which meant there were newer locks I should be aware of, which meant someone had been maintaining this abandoned station for years. My hand went to the pry bar tucked in my belt, cold comfort, but better than nothing, and I stepped inside. Miss O'Connell, I presume. I spun. The voice came from the ticket office, where I'd left my trunk. A man sat on the counter, relaxed as Sunday, with a leather satchel beside him and a camera on a tripod pointed at the walls. He was perhaps 40, dressed in a dark suit that had seen better days, but still maintained an air of professional respectability. Soft-spoken, watchful eyes that smiled when his mouth did. The kind of man who made you forget he was dangerous until it was too late. You presume correctly, I said, keeping my distance. And you are? Jonas Avery. He slid off the counter and extended a hand I didn't take. Journalist? I write about restoration projects and historical preservation for several Western papers. When I heard someone had actually purchased the Carson Depot, I knew I had to document it. Document it. The station, the process, your research. He gestured at the camera. I hope you don't mind. I took the liberty of photographing some of the architectural details while I waited. The Victorian Gothic elements, the freight bay design, it's quite remarkable for a rural spur line. Everything about him was too smooth. Too prepared. Too interested in the wrong details. How did you know I'd purchased it? I asked. The auction was 2 days ago. News doesn't travel that fast. I make it my business to follow government liquidation lists. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, an auction notice, identical to the one I'd received. Any time historical properties come up, I try to be there. Sadly, I was delayed in Carson City. Legal matter. But here I am now, ready to tell your story. My story. Young woman, educated despite obvious financial constraints, takes a chance on a forgotten piece of Western history. He smiled. The expression didn't reach his eyes. It's compelling. Readers love this sort of thing. The underdog finding treasure in unexpected places. The word treasure landed too deliberately. I thought of the ledgers locked in my trunk, the coded card, the mineral samples I'd left with Ruth. I'm a historian, Mr. Avery, not an underdog. And I'm not looking for treasure, just records. Of course. He moved to the camera, adjusting its position. Still, you have to admit there's something romantic about it. This grand old station, all its secrets, a woman alone trying to uncover the truth. I prefer my truth without romance. Don't we all? He glanced at me, and for just a moment, the mask slipped. I saw calculation there, assessment, the look of a man measuring an obstacle. Tell me, Miss O'Connell, have you found anything interesting yet? Old freight manifests, perhaps? Correspondence? There it was. The real question wrapped in casual interest. Dust, I said. Remarkable amounts of dust. And evidence that this building isn't as structurally unsound as the auction notice suggested. Interesting. He walked the perimeter of the ticket office, running his hand along the walls. His fingers paused at the gap where I'd removed the panel, traced the newer nails. Someone's done work here, recently by the look of it. It would seem so. You know, he said, still touching the wall, I've heard stories about this station. Rumors, really, that it was used for more than passenger service. That certain freight went missing here during the height of the silver rush. Never could verify it, of course. Records are notoriously incomplete for the spur lines. I said nothing. Let the silence stretch. He turned to face me fully. There were also stories about bricked-over tunnels, service corridors that don't appear on any official plans, the kind of architectural quirks that suggest someone wanted to move things in and out without documentation. Mr. Avery, I said carefully, are you asking me if I found evidence of smuggling? I'm asking if you found anything that might explain why this station closed so abruptly in 1887. Right after a fire destroyed most of the railway company's audit records. So he knew, or suspected. Either way, he was fishing, and I was the bait he thought would lead him to deeper waters. I've been here 3 days, I said. I've found a marble, some interesting architecture, and confirmation that yes, someone has been maintaining parts of this building. Beyond that, I'm still cataloguing. If you'd like to document the restoration process, you're welcome to photograph the exterior. But my research is proprietary until I'm ready to publish. His jaw tightened. Just a fraction. Just for a moment. Then the professional smile returned. Of course, I wouldn't dream of interfering with your scholarship. He folded his tripod, secured his camera. I'm staying at the boarding house in town, Mrs. Chen's place. Perhaps we could discuss the project over dinner sometime. My treat. I promise I make better company when I'm not conducting ambush interviews in abandoned buildings. Perhaps. He walked to the door, then paused. One more thing. That key you're carrying, the skeleton key. That's a railroad master key, isn't it? Late 1880s design. They only issued those to senior company officials. My hand went to my pocket before I could stop myself. He noticed. Just curious where you came by it, he said. They're collector's items now, worth quite a bit to the right buyer. Came with the property, I lied. Gee, and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Did it? He tipped his hat. Well, good luck with your research, Miss O'Connell. I hope you find what you're looking for, or what's looking for you. He left, boots echoing across the platform. I waited until the sound faded completely, then moved to the window and watched him walk toward town. Halfway down the road, he stopped and looked back. The setting sun caught something on his hand, a flash of gold, a ring, signet ring by the size of it. I'd seen that style before, in my father's papers, in sketches he'd made of documents he was investigating. The Pike family crest, worn by senior members and their closest associates. Jonas Avery wasn't a journalist. Or if he was, that wasn't why he was here. I locked the door he'd left open, wedged a chair under the handle for good measure, and returned to my trunk. The ledgers were still there, still wrapped, still hiding 40 years of theft and murder. Ruth's words echoed, "Don't trust anyone who tells you they're there to help." I pulled out the skeleton key and ran my thumb over its worn teeth. Ruth had said it was for older doors. The station was 3 stories. I'd only explored the ground floor. Somewhere above me, in rooms I hadn't yet reached, there were doors this key would open. Doors that would tell me why my father died. Why the Pike family was still hunting for these records after all this time. Why a man with a camera and a family. Signet ring had shown up 2 days after I bought a building for 30 cents. The sun was setting. Ruth had warned me not to work after dark, but I'd never been good at taking warnings. I returned to town before dawn, while the desert air still held its nighttime chill. The library didn't open until 9, but I found Ruth, sweeping the front steps, moving slowly in the grey light like she'd been expecting me. "You went back," she said. Not a question. "He was waiting for me. Jonas Avery says he's a journalist." Ruth stopped sweeping. Avery, that's not the name he used when he came through here 5 years ago. Then he called himself Thompson. Before that, Mitchell. "He's Pike's man," was Pike's man. Pinkerton agent, retired. Now he freelances for families who need things found quietly. She leaned the broom against the brick wall. "Come inside. We need to talk properly." The library before opening hours felt like a church before service, hushed, waiting, full of potential. Ruth led me past the main reading room to a back office barely larger than a closet. She locked the door behind us. From a drawer in her desk, she pulled out a folder thick with yellowed newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and a map so old the creases had worn through in places. "Your father sat where you're sitting now," Ruth said. 6 years ago. He'd been investigating diverted freight shipments for 3 months. Started as a simple engineering review, routine maintenance checks on track integrity. But he noticed patterns. Manifests that didn't match delivery receipts, or shipments logged but never recorded at their destinations. Money moving in ways that made no sense unless someone was stealing. She spread the map across her desk. It showed the Carson Spur line and its connections to the main Nevada rail system. Someone had marked certain stations with red ink, 8 of them, including the depot I'd bought. "These were the transfer points," Ruth explained. "Places where freight could be offloaded, reweighed, relabeled. Your father discovered they were converting workers' wages into company stock, then using those same workers to transport stolen ore and timber. The workers thought they were building equity. Really, they were building the Pike fortune, the deferred equity system." "Exactly." Ruth pulled out a blueprint fragment, brittle paper covered in architectural drawings. "This is what your father found 3 days before he died. A mezzanine office in the Carson depot that doesn't appear on any public building plans. Hidden access, reinforced walls, a vault. He believed that's where they stored the original stock certificates and wage documentation. Everything they claimed was destroyed in the audit fire." My hands trembled as I took the blueprint. The mezzanine was tucked between the 2nd and 3rd floors, accessible only through a disguised stairwell behind what looked like a supply closet. "The audit fire happened in 1887, Ruth continued. Same year the depot closed to passenger service. But the building didn't close. It became a warehouse for secrets. Samuel Pike's grandfather, Silas Clayton Pike, your SC, he ran the whole operation. When the territorial government started investigating, he staged the fire. destroyed the public records, but he kept private copies. Insurance, leverage, whatever you want to call it. Why didn't you tell anyone? Ruth's eyes met mine, and I saw 40 years of shame there. Because I was 20 years old and terrified, because they threatened my family, because I chose survival over justice. And I've regretted it every day since. She pressed the blueprint into my hands. Your father was braver than I was, and it got him killed. Ruth, Samuel Pike is in Nevada. The words came out rushed, urgent. He arrived in Carson City 2 weeks ago, started buying up old mining rights, railway easements, property adjacent to the spur lines. He's methodical, patient, but he's closing in on something, and I think he knows someone finally bought the depot. That's why the auction. He set it up. Almost certainly. Probably expected one of his own people to purchase it, search it properly, retrieve whatever's hidden in that mezzanine office. She managed a bitter smile. Instead, a stubborn historian with 30 cents ruined his plans. I looked at the blueprint, at the hidden stairwell marked in fading ink. I'm going back. Tonight. Before Avery or Pike or whoever else is watching decides to stop me. Then you'd better know what you're walking into. Ruth opened another drawer and pulled out a leather journal, her own by the look of it. These are the names I remember. The workers who were listed in those wage ledgers. Men and women who died building the spur line, who thought their families would inherit wealth. Instead, their children inherited nothing but stories about fathers who abandoned them. She turned pages filled with neat handwriting, names, dates, brief notes. I couldn't save them. But maybe you can save their memory. Maybe that's worth the risk. I stood to leave, the blueprint tucked carefully in my satchel alongside Ruth's journal. At the door, I paused. Why are you helping me now? Ruth didn't look up from her desk. Because I'm old enough that they can't threaten me with much anymore. And because your father deserved better than a grave full of lies. The walk back to the depot took 3 hours in the noon heat. I saw dust clouds twice on the horizon, riders or wagons moving parallel to my route. Watching, waiting to see what I'd do next. Let them watch. I had a key, a blueprint, and the stubborn belief that truth matters more than safety. My father died believing that. Maybe it ran in the family. The storm hit as I reached the depot, one of those sudden desert tempests that turn the sky black and shake the earth with thunder. Perfect cover for what I was about to do. I lit 3 oil lamps and positioned them around the ticket office, casting overlapping circles of light. The blueprint showed the hidden stairwell behind the second-floor supply closet, accessible through a panel that would slide rather than swing. The stairs to the second floor groaned under my weight, each step protesting years of disuse. Rain hammered the roof above me, and somewhere in the building's skeleton, wind found purchase and howled. The supply closet was exactly where the blueprint indicated, a narrow door at the end of a hallway, lined with rooms that had once been offices. Inside, shelves held rotted canvas bags and rusted tools, but the back wall looked wrong, too shallow. The room should have extended another 4 feet based on the exterior dimensions. I ran my hands along the wall until I found it, a seam disguised in the vertical paneling. Ruth's skeleton key fit into a hole I might have missed entirely, hidden behind a shelf bracket. The mechanism clicked. The wall slid sideways with a sound like a sigh. Beyond it, stairs climbed into darkness. I took a lamp and climbed. The passage was barely wide enough for my shoulders, the ceiling so low I had to duck. Whoever designed this wanted it hidden from casual discovery. The mezzanine office was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12, but meticulously organized. A desk sat beneath a narrow window, papers still arranged on its surface as if someone had simply stepped away. Filing cabinets lined one wall, and on a pedestal in the corner sat a steel box, locked, roughly the size of a large book. The papers on the desk made my breath catch. A ledger labeled Deferred Equity Master Record lay open to a page, dated March 1887. Below it, telegraph carbon copies showing transmission records, instructions written in a careful hand, convert all wages to equity certificates, issue Series D stock, hold original documentation pending territorial audit completion. But there was no gold, no stolen ore, just paper. I opened the filing cabinets. Inside, folders organized by year, each containing stock certificates, ornate documents with elaborate borders and official seals. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Each one made out to a different name, with denominations ranging from $10 to $500. The names Ruth had written in her journal were here, along with hundreds more: Chinese rail workers, Irish laborers, black freedmen who'd come west seeking new lives. All of them promised equity, all of them given paper that was supposed to mature into fortune. I did the math on the back of a telegram. If these certificates had been honored, if the stock had been allowed to appreciate as promised, the aggregate value would exceed $28 million in current money, $28 million stolen from people who had nothing. People who built an empire with their hands and backs and lives, then were erased from its history. The steel box sat waiting. I tried Ruth's key, too small. Tried the pry bar, the lock was too well made. But the telegraph carbons gave me an idea. I sorted through them until I found one dated April 1887. Audit fire confirmed. Transfer all Series D certificates to S.C. Pike Private Vault. Combination 17338. The lock wasn't a key lock. It was a combination lock. My hands shook as I spun the dial. 17338. The lock clicked. The lid opened. Inside, more stock certificates, these ones signed by Silas Clayton Pike himself, deed notes for property throughout Nevada, and a single telegram, recent, the paper still white, the ink still black. Depot purchased, initiate recovery protocol, contain and retrieve. SPSP Samuel Pike. The telegram was dated 3 days ago. The day after I bought the station, I heard them before I saw them. Footsteps below, multiple sets, moving through the building with purpose. Then Jonas Avery's voice, carrying up through the hidden stairwell. She's here somewhere, check the upper floors. I killed my lamp. Gathered the master ledger, the telegraph carbons, and as many stock certificates as I could stuff in my satchel. The steel box I couldn't carry, but I photographed its contents with the small camera I'd brought. Insurance, evidence, something. A second voice. Deeper, cultured. Mr. Avery, please remember, we want the documentation intact, and Miss O'Connell unharmed, if possible. She's more useful as an ally than a martyr. Samuel Pike himself. Here, now. I looked around frantically. The window was too narrow. The stairwell was my only exit, and they were coming up. The room had no other doors, no... Wait, the desk. It sat oddly close to the wall, leaving a gap barely visible in the darkness. I squeezed behind it and found what the architect had built, a mail chute. Not for letters, for documents. Large enough for files, ledgers, anything that needed to reach the ground floor quickly. Large enough for a desperate historian. I pushed the satchel down first, heard it hit bottom with a muffled thump. Then I squeezed in after it, feet first, using my back and knees to control my descent through the narrow shaft. I dropped into darkness, landing hard in what felt like a storage room. My ankle screamed, but I could walk. I grabbed my satchel and felt along the wall until I found a door. It opened into a passage I hadn't known existed. A tunnel, stone-lined, sloping down into the earth beneath the station. The air was cold and mineral-rich, and somewhere ahead I heard water dripping. Behind me in the mezzanine office, Samuel Pike's voice echoed. She was just here. Find her! I ran into the darkness, one hand on the tunnel wall, the other clutching evidence that $28 million worth of justice had been waiting 40 years to be found. The tunnel ended at a bricked-over wall. Dead end. I turned, ready to fight or flee, and found Jonas Avery blocking the passage behind me. But his gun was lowered, pointed at the ground instead of at me. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't run. And don't scream. Just listen. You work for Pike. I work for whoever pays. Currently, yes, that's Pike, but I need you to understand something, Miss O'Connell." He glanced over his shoulder, back toward the station. "Pike is coming down here in about 3 minutes. When he arrives, he's going to make you an offer. A good one. Money, recognition, safety, and if I refuse?" Jonas's jaw tightened. Then I stopped being the reasonable option. Footsteps echoed in the tunnel. A lantern's glow preceded its bearer, and then Samuel Pike stepped into view. He was nothing like I expected. 60 perhaps, but vigorous. Tailored suit despite the dust and debris. Silver hair combed back from a face that suggested intelligence and patience in equal measure. He looked like someone's kindly uncle. He looked like power wearing a pleasant mask. Miss O'Connell. He set his lantern on the ground between us, creating a pool of civilized light in the darkness. "I apologize for the dramatic circumstances. I'd hoped we could meet over dinner, like reasonable people. But you've been rather elusive." I said nothing. Kept my satchel pressed against my side. "I know what you found," Pike continued. "The ledgers, the certificates, the telegrams. My family's history, preserved in ink and paper. You're a historian. You understand the value of primary sources. I understand the value of truth." "Truth," he smiled. "Such an interesting word. Flexible, contextual. The truth is, my great-grandfather built this railway system, brought civilization to the desert, created jobs, established towns, connected markets. The workers were compensated fairly for their time. They were given worthless paper. They were given opportunity, stock in a growing enterprise. Not my family's fault that most of them sold their shares for pennies or lost them, or simply died before the equity matured. You stole their wages. I inherited a legacy." His voice remained calm, almost gentle. "As did you, Miss O'Connell. Your father was a brilliant engineer. Tragic what happened. Faulty brakes." Such accidents were common in those days. The casual mention of my father's death, the implicit threat, made my hands curl into fists. Pike reached into his coat. Jonas tensed, but the older man only pulled out an envelope. $5,000. Enough to publish your research through a respectable university press. Enough to live comfortably while you establish your academic career. All I ask is that you let me reclaim what belongs to my family. The certificates, the ledgers. They're just paper, Miss O'Connell. They can't bring those workers back. Can't undo history. They can rewrite it. Whose version? He took a step closer. You give those documents to a court, what happens? Years of litigation. Lawyers getting rich while descendants fight over claims. Half the families don't even know their ancestors worked these lines. You'll spend your youth in depositions instead of research. And for what? Justice? He said the word like it amused him. Justice is what those with power say it is. Always has been. No. No? His pleasant expression didn't change, but something cooled in his eyes. Then let me clarify your options. You can accept my offer. Money, recognition, a career. Or you can fight me. And Miss O'Connell, I've been fighting for 40 years to protect my family's interests. I'm very, very good at it. Is that a threat? It's a reality. I own judges. I employ lawyers who make problems disappear. I have resources you cannot imagine. Your truth against my power. How do you think that ends? I looked at Jonas. His face was unreadable, but his gun hand had moved slightly toward his holster. Not threatening, preparing. I need time to think, I said. Pike smiled. Of course. Take the night. Consider carefully. He turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. That tunnel you're standing in, it's the only way out. And I'm locking the station behind me to give you privacy for your deliberations. Dawn should give you enough time to make the right choice. He walked away, taking his lantern. Jonas followed, but at the passage entrance, he looked back. He's not bluffing, Jonas said. About any of it. Then the darkness swallowed them both. A distant door slammed. A lock clicked. I was alone in the tunnel with $28 million in stolen wages and a choice between truth and survival. My lamp flickered. I had perhaps 4 hours of oil left. I pulled out the ledger and read names by lantern light. Workers who'd died building an empire. Families who'd inherited nothing but silence. My father's name was in this ledger. Listed as a consultant. Paid in deferred equity. Killed for asking questions. The choice wasn't as hard as Pike thought. The bricked wall wasn't solid. I'd learned that much examining buildings. Walls built to hide things were built quickly, carelessly, assuming no one would look too closely. This one was the same. I used the pry bar, working at the mortar around the edges. It crumbled, old and poorly mixed. Within 20 minutes, I'd loosened enough bricks to create a gap. Air moved through it. Fresh air with the smell of desert sage and night. I widened the gap until I could squeeze through, pushing my satchel ahead of me. On the other side, the tunnel continued, sloping upward now, natural stone instead of railroad construction. The walls showed pick marks. This passage was old, maybe older than the depot itself. Mining exploratory shaft, probably, abandoned when it didn't yield ore. I followed it up, my lamp burning lower. The passage narrowed, widened, turned, and then I saw moonlight. The tunnel mouth opened onto a wash a quarter-mile from the depot. Sagebrush clustered around the entrance, hiding it from casual view. And standing near the opening, ears pricked forward, was a Mustang. The horse was small, desert-bred, with a coat the color of dust and eyes that reflected my lamplight like amber coins. It didn't run, just watched me emerge from the earth like some creature of myth. Easy, I whispered, though I didn't know why. The horse tilted its head, curious. I had salt in my pocket, always carried it for purifying water samples. I poured a handful into my palm and extended it slowly. The Mustang approached, sniffed, licked the salt with a tongue as rough as gratitude. "You're a long way from anywhere," I told it. The horse butted its head against my shoulder, warm and alive and real. In that moment, standing in the desert darkness with a wild horse and a satchel full of stolen history, I understood something. Pike thought he'd trapped me, thought he'd forced a choice between comfort and conscience. But I'd spent 3 years being trapped, by poverty, by sexism, by a system that valued power over truth. I'd spent 6 years mourning my father, believing his death was meaningless. I wasn't trapped anymore. And his death could mean something. The Mustang, I'd already started thinking of it as salt, for the gift that earned its trust, stood patient while I figured out my next move. The depot was locked. Pike would return at dawn, expecting surrender, but I had the ledgers. I had the certificates. I had Ruth's testimony and my father's research and evidence that $28 million in justice had been buried for 40 years. And I had Jonas Avery's words. He's not bluffing about any of it. Neither was I. I led Salt back through the tunnel, through the gap in the bricks, into the passage beneath the depot. The horse balked at first, darkness, enclosed space against every instinct. But I kept my hand on its neck, kept talking, kept moving forward. We emerged in the storage room beneath the mezzanine. The station above was silent. Pike's men had left. Confident I was contained, I filled my satchel with everything I could carry from the mezzanine office. The master ledger, the telegraph carbons, 24 stock certificates as samples, the deed notes, evidence enough to build a case, light enough to run. Then I did something Pike wouldn't expect. I'd left him a message. On the desk in the mezzanine office, I arranged the remaining certificates in a pattern he'd recognize. The Pike family crest, made from the stolen wages of hundreds of workers. In the center, I placed one of his own telegrams with a note written on the back. Justice is what those with power say it is. Let's test that theory. Monsieur O'Connell, Salt was waiting when I climbed back down. Together, we walked through the tunnel to the wash, then followed the dry riverbed away from the depot as dawn began graying the eastern sky. I needed to reach Ruth. Needed to get these documents somewhere safe. Needed to find someone Pike didn't own. A judge, a marshal, anyone who'd listen. Behind me, the depot sat silent against the brightening sky, waiting for Pike to discover I'd refused his generous offer. Ahead, the desert stretched open and unforgiving. Somewhere out there was justice, or at least the chance to fight for it. Salt walked beside me, steady and sure, as if wild horses understood better than most that some runs are worth the risk. I reached the library as the sun cleared the horizon. Ruth was already there, standing in the doorway, as if she'd been waiting all night. Her face went pale when she saw me, dust-covered, leading a wild horse, clutching my satchel like it held the world's secrets, which in a way it did. "Inside," she said. "Quickly!" She led me past the main reading room to a door I'd never noticed before, hidden behind a shelf of territorial histories. Beyond it, a narrow staircase descended to a basement reading room, windowless, lit by gas lamps, lined with archives that smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals. The Historical Society used this space before they lost funding, Ruth explained, locking the door behind us. "No one remembers it's here except me. We have maybe an hour before Pike realizes you're gone." I spread the contents of my satchel across a reading table. The master ledger, the telegraph carbons, the stock certificates, the deed notes. 40 years of theft and murder, documented in meticulous detail. Ruth's hands trembled as she touched the ledger. "My God, you found it all." "Not all. There's more at the depot. Hundreds of certificates, more correspondence. But this is enough. Enough to prove what happened. Enough to..." The door at the top of the stairs rattled. "Someone testing the lock." We froze. Then Jonas Avery's voice, low and urgent. "Ruth, it's me." "Let me in." Ruth looked at me. I nodded, though my hand went to the pry bar in my belt. She unlocked the door. Jonas descended quickly, alone, his professional composure cracked by something that looked like genuine agitation. "Pike knows you're gone," he said without preamble. "He's mobilizing every man he has in the territory. You have maybe 30 minutes before they start searching buildings systematically. Why are you here?" I demanded. "Because I read your message." Jonas pulled a folded paper from his pocket, the note I'd left in the mezzanine office. "That was either very brave or very stupid. Both, probably. Pike is offering $5,000 for your location, $10,000 for the documents. And he's made it clear that you don't need to be in good condition when found, just breathing." Ruth moved to stand beside me. "Then we need to move faster. Jonas, you worked for the Pinkertons. You know how to document evidence for legal proceedings. I'm not helping you." But even as he said it, Jonas was pulling a camera from his coat, the same one he'd brought to the depot. "I'm not helping you," he repeated softer. "I'm just photographing historical documents for my own records. What you do with your copies is your business." He set up the camera with practiced efficiency. Ruth began arranging documents under the gas lamps, her librarian's training evident in how she positioned each page for maximum clarity. And I started reading names aloud. Chen Wei-ming, railroad laborer. Died 1886, rock slide during tunnel construction. Owed $347 in wages, converted to Series D stock. Jonas's camera clicked. Michael Brennan, track layer. Died 1887, cave-in at mile marker 47, owed $192. Click! Sarah Edmonds, cook for work crews, survived the construction but died in poverty 1889, owed $89. Click. We worked through the ledger, photograph by photograph, name by name. It felt like a prayer, a memorial service for people who died believing their labor meant something, believing their families would inherit wealth instead of dust. Ruth's voice joined mine halfway through. She knew some of these names, had typed the letters that promised them equity, had watched them die forgotten. Jonas said nothing, but his jaw was tight. His hands shook slightly as he changed photographic plates. Then I found it, near the end of the ledger in a section marked Engineering Consultants, Patrick O'Connell, Safety Inspector. Contracted 1893, investigated freight discrepancies and payroll irregularities. Contract terminated 1894. And beside his name, in different ink, a notation, accident, brake failure, case closed. My father, listed like any other worker they'd used and discarded. Maggie. Ruth reached for my hand. "Keep photographing," I said, though my voice cracked. He'd want us to finish. We documented perhaps half the ledger when we smelled smoke. Jonas moved to the door first, pressing his palm against the wood. "It's hot. They've set a fire upstairs." "The alley door," Ruth said. "There's an exit to the freight yard behind the building. Book chute we used for deliveries. She led us to a metal chute in the corner, barely 3 feet wide. The kind of passage meant for sliding books down, not climbing through, but desperation makes us flexible. I went first, the satchel strapped across my chest, sliding down into darkness. I landed in an alley thick with smoke, the library's back wall already showing flames at the windows. Ruth came next, then Jonas, carrying the camera and as many photographic plates as he could manage. Salt was where I'd left her, tied behind the library. The horse's eyes showed white with fear from the smoke, but she steadied when I touched her neck. "The telegraph office," Jonas said, coughing. "We need to wire Carson City. There's a circuit judge there, Judge Hamilton. He's honest. One of the few Pike doesn't own. Pike will have men watching the telegraph office. Then we don't go through the front door." We moved through the early morning streets, keeping to alleys, avoiding the main roads where Pike's hired men were already gathering. The telegraph office sat on Main Street, but it backed onto the same freight yard as the library. Jonas picked the rear lock with a piece of wire, Pinkerton training, and we slipped inside. The telegrapher was a kid, maybe 20, who looked terrified when 3 strangers emerged from his stockroom, covered in soot and dust. "Don't send anything from here," Jonas told him. "But you can receive messages, yes?" The kid nodded. Jonas wrote out a telegram in careful block letters. "Judge Hamilton, stop evidence of railroad fraud and murder. Stop need emergency injunction. Stop witnesses prepared to testify. Stop Ash Hollow, Nevada. Stop urgent stop." He handed it to the kid along with a gold coin. "Send this from the next town over. Take the morning train. Don't come back until you get a reply. Understand?" The kid looked at the coin, then at us, then at the smoke rising from the library's direction. He understood enough. After he left, we waited. The telegraph key sat silent. Outside, I could hear shouting, Pike's men searching buildings, demanding information from townspeople who probably had no idea what was happening. Ruth sat at the telegraph desk writing. I looked over her shoulder and saw she was drafting a sworn statement. Everything she knew, everything she'd witnessed, everything she'd helped hide for 40 years. "If we die today," she said without looking up, "this needs to survive." Jonas was drafting his own statement, confessing to his work for Pike, detailing the orders he'd been given, naming names. I added my father's letters to the pile, his research, his notes about freight discrepancies and mysterious accidents. We were building a case in paper and ink, racing against men who'd spent decades destroying evidence. The telegraph key began clicking. Jonas leaned over it, translating the Morse. "Judge Hamilton, responding stop injunction granted. Stop deputies en route. Stop hold position. Stop ETA 6 hours. Stop 6 hours. We just needed to survive 6 hours. Then the front window shattered. Pike's men, done with subtle searching, were moving to direct action. "Back door," Jonas said. "Now!" We grabbed everything, documents, camera plates, statements, and ran. Salt was already nervous, dancing sideways as smoke from the library drifted across the freight yard. "We can't stay in town," I said. 6 hours is too long. They'll find us." "Then we don't stay in town." Jonas looked at the morning sun, calculating. "The old way station at Telegraph Pass, 15 miles east on the Carson Road. If the judge is coming from Carson City, he'll pass right by it. We intercept him there, 15 miles on foot, on horse." Jonas looked at Salt. "She can carry the documents." We run alongside. Ruth shook her head. "I'll slow you down. My knees aren't what they were." "Ruth, I'll create a distraction. Lead them away from you." She pressed her statement into my hands. "I've lived with cowardice long enough. Let me die brave." "You're not dying," I said fiercely. "Any of us. We're going to win this. We're going to make them answer for everything." Ruth smiled, touched my cheek. "Your father would be proud. Now go." She walked out the front door of the telegraph office, hands raised, calling Pike's name. Drawing every eye toward her, we ran. The 15 miles to Telegraph Pass felt like 50. The sun climbed higher, punishing us with heat that turned the desert into a furnace. Jonas and I took turns leading Salt, who carried the documents in improvised saddlebags made from my coat. Behind us, dust clouds marked Pike's pursuit. He'd figured out our direction within an hour. "They have horses and wagons," Jonas said, looking back. "They'll overtake us before we reach the pass. Then we find another way." The way station appeared. As the sun reached its zenith, a small adobe structure, at the junction where the Carson Road split toward the mining territories. It was supposed to be a temporary shelter for travelers, nothing more. Instead, we found Judge Hamilton waiting. He was a small man, perhaps 50, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the careful manner of someone who'd survived territorial politics by being both smart and incorruptible. He'd brought a stenographer, a county sheriff I didn't recognize, and 2 deputies. "Miss O'Connell?" he asked as we approached. "Yes, sir. You've had quite a morning." My clerk received a rather alarming telegram. I set my satchel on a bench outside the way station, pulled out the master ledger, the certificates, the statements Ruth and Jonas had written. "Your Honor, I have evidence of systematic wage theft, fraud, and murder spanning 40 years. The Pike family converted railroad workers' wages into worthless stock, then destroyed records in a staged audit fire. My father was killed investigating this conspiracy, and Samuel Pike is currently pursuing us with the intent to destroy this evidence and likely kill anyone who's seen it." Judge Hamilton took the ledger. "Read 3 pages, then looked at his sheriff, set a perimeter. No one approaches without my permission." The sheriff deployed his deputies. Jonas handed over his camera plates and gave his statement. Former Pinkerton agent hired by Pike, ordered to retrieve or destroy documents by any means necessary. I testified next, walking the judge through everything I'd found: the hidden compartment, the mezzanine office, the tunnel, the ledger of names. "These stock certificates," Judge Hamilton said, examining them carefully. "If they'd been honored as promised, what would they be worth today?" "Approximately $28 million, Your Honor, accounting for stock splits, dividends, and corporate mergers." The judge was quiet for a long moment. "That's not a fortune, Miss O'Connell. That's a reckoning." That's when Pike arrived. His carriage came down the Carson Road with 4 mounted men flanking it. He dismounted with the careful dignity of a man who'd never doubted his right to control any situation. "Judge Hamilton," he said pleasantly, "this is unexpected. I wasn't aware you were in the territory. Emergency injunction. Mr. Pike, I've frozen all assets connected to the Pike Railway Company pending investigation of fraud allegations." Pike's pleasant expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Fraud allegations, based on the ravings of a debt-ridden academic and a disgraced Pinkerton, based on documentary evidence that appears quite credible, evidence stolen from my family's private property, evidence of crimes that have no statute of limitations. Mr. Pike, wage theft, conspiracy, murder. Pike laughed, actually laughed. "Murder? My dear judge, you're listening to women's gossip and convenient accusations from hired thugs trying to avoid prosecution for their own crimes." "I've read the ledgers," Judge Hamilton said quietly. "I've seen the names. I've read the telegrams ordering the audit fire. Your great-grandfather's signature is quite distinctive. Ancient history. Half those workers are dead. The other half wouldn't even remember." "My father remembered," I said, stepping forward. "Patrick O'Connell, listed in your ledger as terminated by accident. He was investigating you when his train's brakes failed." Pike turned to look at me fully for the first time. "I had nothing to do with your father's accident. That was 40 years of poor maintenance and bad luck. It was 6 years ago, and the maintenance records show the brakes were inspected 2 days before by your company's own mechanics." Something shifted in Pike's face. The gentleman's mask slipped, and beneath it was pure entitlement, the absolute conviction that he was owed everything and accountable for nothing. "You're making a mistake." "Judge," he said, his voice dropping its pleasant tone, "the Pike family built this territory. We brought civilization to the desert. We created the infrastructure that allows your courts to even exist. You think you can challenge us with paper and testimony from nobodies. I think the law applies to everyone, Mr. Pike, even railroad barons. The law is what people with power say it is. Pike turned to his men. That evidence is stolen property. Retrieve it. The sheriff's deputies raised their rifles. Pike's men stopped. For a moment, everything balanced on the edge of violence. Then Judge Hamilton spoke, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Samuel Pike, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, destruction of evidence, and suspicion of murder." "Sheriff, take him into custody." Pike smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd spent his whole life winning. "You can't arrest me out here, Judge. This is federal territory. You have no jurisdiction. I have an emergency writ from the territorial governor. Signed this morning." Judge Hamilton produced the paper. "I'm placing you in custody, pending transport to Carson City for formal arraignment. Your assets are frozen. Your companies are under immediate audit, and every name in that ledger will be investigated." Pike's smile finally died. The sheriff moved forward with shackles. Pike's men looked at each other, calculating odds, then slowly raised their hands. They were hired muscle, not martyrs. As they led Pike to the sheriff's wagon, he looked back at me. "This won't stand," he said. "I have lawyers. I have judges who actually understand how the world works. I have resources you can't imagine. You have 40 years of stolen wages," I said, "and I have the names of everyone you stole from. Let's see which matters more." They loaded him into the wagon. The deputies mounted up. Judge Hamilton gathered the documents carefully, treating them with the reverence they deserved. "Miss O'Connell," he said, "you'll need to testify in Carson City. Formal deposition. Possibly a grand jury. I'll be there. And you should know, once this becomes public, you'll be famous. Or infamous, depending on who's asked. The woman who brought down the Pike Empire. I just want justice for my father. And for all the names in that ledger." Judge Hamilton nodded. "Sometimes justice and fame arrive together, whether we want them or not." The sheriff's convoy began moving toward Carson City. Jonas stood beside me, watching them go. "What will you do now?" I asked him. "Testify. Tell the truth. Probably spend some time in jail for my part in all this." He managed a rueful smile. "But I'll sleep better than I have in years. You could have stayed with Pike, gotten paid. I could have. But I read those names, Miss O'Connell, and I remembered I used to believe in something other than money." He tipped his hat. "Good luck with everything." He walked toward town, leaving me alone with Salt and the desert sunrise. The trial lasted 3 months. Pike's lawyers were everything he'd promised. Skilled, ruthless, and willing to use every procedural trick known to territorial law. They challenged the evidence. They challenged my credibility. They challenged Ruth's testimony and Jonas's statements and Judge Hamilton's jurisdiction. But they couldn't challenge the names. 843 workers documented in the ledger. We found descendants for 617 of them. Chinese families who'd kept letters. Irish communities who'd maintained church records. Black families who'd preserved everything because they knew how easily history forgot them. They came to Carson City. They testified. They brought their own documentation, letters promising equity, photographs of fathers and grandfathers who'd worked the railway, death certificates that matched the ledger's dates. The Pike lawyers tried to overwhelm us with paperwork. We responded with people. Ruth testified for 2 full days, walking the court through the entire conspiracy. The stock conversion scheme, the audit fire, the systematic erasure of records. She produced her own hidden cash, letters she'd kept for 40 years, insurance against exactly this moment. Jonas testified about the orders he'd received, the evidence he'd been told to destroy, the witnesses he'd been told to intimidate. He named names, judges Pike had paid, officials Pike owned, rivals Pike had eliminated, and I testified about my father, about finding him in a depot I'd bought for 30 cents, about following his research to the truth he died trying to expose. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty, on all counts. The judge ordered Pike's assets liquidated. The territorial government seized the railway company pending reorganization. And most importantly, he ordered the creation of a compensation fund. Every dollar Pike had would go toward paying the descendants of the workers he'd stolen from. $28 million. Not enough to make anyone rich. Divided among 617 families, it was perhaps $45,000 each. But it was acknowledgement, recognition, justice, even if delayed by decades. The territorial government offered me the depot. Free and clear, all charges and liens removed. They wanted to demolish it, but I refused. Instead, I turned it into something better. The Railroad Workers Memorial and Research Center opened 6 months after the trial ended. The ticket office became an archive. The waiting room became a museum. The mezzanine office, the room where I'd found the evidence, became a reading room where descendants could research their families' histories. And on the freight room wall, we inscribed every name from the ledger. 843 workers who built an empire with their hands and were erased from its history. Now permanent, remembered, honored, Ruth became the center's first archivist. She spent her remaining years documenting oral histories, tracking down descendants, and ensuring that the full truth was preserved for future generations. She died at her desk 3 years later, surrounded by the records she'd once been ordered to burn. Jonas testified in 14 more cases against Pike associates and corrupt officials. He served 2 years for his role in the conspiracy, then went to work as an investigator for the Territorial Labor Commission. Last I heard, he was helping organize unions for mine workers. Judge Hamilton was appointed to the Territorial Supreme Court. His first major ruling established that wage theft was equivalent to robbery under territorial law, precedent that protected workers across the West. Samuel Pike died in prison while his appeals were pending. His family's empire was dismantled piece by piece. The Pike name became synonymous not with progress, but with the human cost of unchecked greed. As for me, I published my research. Not in an academic journal that no one would read, but as a book, The 30-Cent Fortune, How Railroad Workers Built America and Were Written Out of History. It became required reading in schools across 3 territories. I still live at the depot, in rooms I've converted into modest quarters. Salt lives in a stable I built behind the building. She's older now, grey showing in her muzzle, but she still greets me every morning with the patient trust of a creature that's seen the worst of humans and chosen to believe in them. Anyway, sometimes I walk the platform at sunset and imagine the workers who once stood here. Men and women who believed their labor would mean something, who trusted in promises made by people they'd never meet, who built roads and laid track and died, believing their children would inherit prosperity. They didn't get prosperity, but they got something better. They got remembered. Their names are carved in stone now. Their stories are preserved in archives. Their descendants received compensation and acknowledgement. And every person who visits this memorial learns that history isn't written by those with power. It's written by those with courage enough to challenge power. Bought a railway station for 30 cents. I found a $28 million fortune in its walls, but the real discovery was simpler. Truth matters. Justice matters. And sometimes, if you're stubborn enough and brave enough and lucky enough, you can rewrite history to include the voices that were meant to stay silent. My father taught me that. He died believing it. I lived to prove it. Epilogue. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a territorial postal worker who apologized for its delay. It had been written 6 years earlier, mailed the day before my father died. He'd addressed it to me, but marked it to be delivered only in the event of my death. Inside, his careful handwriting, "Dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, then I was right to be afraid. And I'm sorry I won't be there to see you graduate, to read your work, to watch you become the historian I always knew you'd be. I've spent 3 months investigating the Pike Railway Company. What I've found would end careers and possibly topple empires. But I've also learned something more important. Truth has a way of surviving, even when those who speak it don't. I've hidden copies of my research, some in obvious places where Pike will find and destroy them, others where only someone who thinks like you would look. Behind wall panels, in hidden compartments, in buildings marked for demolition, but worth preserving. If you're reading this, it means I underestimated how dangerous this knowledge is. But I know you, my brilliant, stubborn girl. You won't let it rest. You'll keep asking questions. You'll keep digging, so dig carefully. Trust sparingly. Document everything. And remember, history doesn't belong to those who win. It belongs to those who survive to tell the truth about what happened. I love you. I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry I won't be there when you need me most, but I left you everything you need. You just have to be brave enough to find it. Your father, Patrick O'Connell. I read the letter 3 times, sitting on the depot platform as the sun set over the desert. Then I carefully folded it and added it to the archives, filed under O'Connell Patrick, personal correspondence. My father had been right about everything. Including me, I'd found what he'd hidden. I'd told the truth he'd died protecting, and I'd survived to ensure that history remembered not just him, but all of them, 843 names, including one that mattered most to me. I walked to the freight room wall and found it, carved in stone with all the others. Patrick O'Connell, engineer and inspector, 1857-1894. Truth matters, truth matters. Justice matters. And sometimes a 30-cent purchase can buy something more valuable than fortune. It can buy the future back from those who tried to steal the past. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.